This episode is brought to you by AARP. 10 years from today, Lisa Schneider will trade in her office job to become the leader of a pack of dogs. As the owner of her own dog rescue, that is. A second act made possible by the reskilling courses Lisa's taking now with AARP to help make sure her income lives as long as she does. And she can finally run with the big dogs. And the small dogs, who just think they're big dogs. That's why the younger you are, the more you need AARP. Learn more at aarp.org/skills.
Earning your degree online doesn't mean you have to go about it alone. At Capella University, we're here to support you when you're ready. From enrollment counselors who get to know you and your goals, to academic coaches who can help you form a plan to stay on track. We care about your success and are dedicated to helping you pursue your goals. Going back to school is a big step, but having support at every step of your academic journey can make a big difference. Imagine your future differently at capella.edu.
Hey, hello everybody, and welcome to the Media Roundtable, Oxford Road's podcast where we dive deep into the secrets of the craft of audio advertising and where we seek to provide our perspective on all of the industry topics that are currently bubbling up and everybody's discussing. And all of this is done in service of the marketeers that ultimately we're all working for and advising. Marketeers responsible for the success of their company's audio programs, and which we've lovingly called the chief audio officers. And with regards to that, I'm Steve Abraham. I'm president of Oxford Road. And on this special edition of the MRT, we're going to go all internazionale because all of my illustrious guests that I'm sharing the pod with this week, we all got together and we were all fortunate enough to spend some time at the International Podcast Show, which was hosted in London last week on the 21st and 22nd of May. And joining me in the discussion, I've got, as I said, some great guests. I have Amelia Coomber, Head of Marketing and Growth at Podscribe. Thanks for joining, Amelia.
Thanks so much.
We have James Cridland, the editor of Podnews and Podcast Business Journal, also the keynote speaker on the first day. Welcome, James.
Thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to hear another English accent on this podcast.
There's going to be three of us today, as you know, but and with that, actually, I'm delighted also to welcome my two regular colleagues at Oxford Road, Giles, head of EVP of Strategy and Measurement, and Miranda Romano, who was my partner in crime at the event last week, walking me around and showing me the sights of London as I'd never seen them before. And it was a great time had by all, albeit we had to carry a brolly, James, which I know you said at the beginning of your speech last week, because London didn't disappoint and it was a very rainy few days, but very productive. And with that, I'm just going to jump straight in. You know, obviously, we're talking about an international side of the business, and all of us were lucky there. I'm just going to kick off with a couple of key stats to get us going. I'm sure they can be argued from various different sources, but I think one of the things that struck me and has been most interesting is the moment we're seeing global listening spike at the moment as a consequence of all of the different platforms merging together. Over 500 million listeners by the end of year of 2024 in terms of the growth of podcast listenership, up by almost 10% year on year. And as a consequence, that's had a direct result into advertising spend. I mean, last year, the total global amount that was speculated by Statista for podcasts was around about 3.5 billion. And this year, we're expected to see that surpass even 4 million, so a 15% growth. So it's very timely, and we know where that growth's coming from. We've seen enormous increase in listenership and uptake of the platform in Latin America and Europe, and all of the different sort of adoption rates that are taking place around the world. So with that, I'd love to sort of jump in because I think this is going to be a fun one. But before we get into any specific questions, I was a newbie to the International Podcast Show. I'd been to the podcast movement show here in the US and the Evolutions and all of those different events, but I had not been to the international one, which I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, this is the third one. This is the third year, right? Is that correct? Yeah. So anyway, before I get into that, I'd just love to ask you all, how was your experience? Had you been before, and what did you generally make of the show this year?
It was my first time. I thought it was awesome. I think the first thing I noticed was, wow, there's a lot of accents in one room, which is really, really cool. But no, I mean, it was just a great time. And I've been to a bunch of the podcast movements here, and I think that there's a lot of similarities, but it was just so great to meet, obviously, like some of our international, like clients and things like that. But, just really see how large and how fast the podcast space is growing outside of our little bubble, which is the US. So yeah, it was just an awesome time.
Absolutely. Miranda, how about you? Because I know you were a first timer like me.
I'm a first timer as well. It was really an incredible experience. I think the one thing that impressed me the most was just the sense of collaboration and willingness to share insights and information. Felt a lot less competitive and more community focused than what I've seen in the US. And I think just in general, there was a lot more excitement, people really leaning in, hungry to learn. And in general, there was a lot more diversity in topics, which, I guess might be expected given it's a global conference.
Absolutely. Giles and James, I know you have both participated. Giles, because I know I signed off on your travel last year to go. But while you were there, did you see anything drastically different year on year? And I'd love to get your perspective as well after James, because I know you've obviously been a regular.
Well, I think James has more familiarity than me, probably. Last year I was there. It felt similar this year. I think the energy was really good this year. I think I definitely sort of picked up on some of that positivity and sort of collaborative spirit that Miranda's referring to. I think it's a really refreshing change from the US. I think that the content was a bit more diverse this year. I was talking to one of the organizers, and I think the number of attendees from brands had almost doubled year on year as a proportion of the audience. So I think that, introduces diversity of content, but also sort of speaks to, the growing life stage of the growing maturity of the industry, and, its increasing appetite for, the advertising dollars that ultimately are going to, fuel the growth and prosperity for everyone.
Yeah, and I would certainly agree with that. It was a really interesting and fun time. I always feel slightly patriotic being a Brit. I know I live in Australia these days, but being a Brit and being there and seeing just the vibrancy and the excitement of the podcast show in such a lovely venue. And, I think one of the real benefits is that it's in the same place every year. So I now know where to go and find a decent coffee off-site. I know where some decent restaurants are. I know all of the places to go, and that's really nice. But I think also just, seeing the little incremental changes that they've made. This year there was a creator stage specifically for those people who are making podcasts, which was a brand new thing which they haven't had before. And just seeing, just some of the little interesting changes. But another really well put together conference that you can have a listen back to as well, because they've put every single stage on a supporting cast paid for feed. So you can actually go back and have a listen to every single thing too.
So surprising, they created a podcast.
Yes, who'd have thought it?
I must admit, it was my first time. I was incredibly surprised and very positively so. I thought it was a supremely well organized show. Not to be in any way, shape or form disrespectful to our dear US colleagues who put on Podcast Movement, which is also exceptionally well run. But for only the third year, I was very impressed. And one thing that struck me was, and perhaps this is because of the sort of beginning, more, I guess, more immature nature of the podcasting business outside of the US. I was surprised at the volume of speaking panels and companies that were there that were really related to the growth of the marketing experience in podcast, and a lot less in terms of hardware. Now, maybe moving forward as podcast increases, there'll be even more hardware kind of businesses that turn up because they know it's increasing. But I thought it was really interesting that it was most of the booths there were research companies or industry players within the marketing and advertising and brand space, which I thought was really, really noticeable for me at least. So with the first question, and we kind of answered it, but what do you think this says about the growth and development of podcasting and the growth specifically into the international business? And Giles, I'm going to pose that one to you.
Yeah, I think it feels a lot like the US was perhaps 4, 5, 6 years ago, where there's a sort of, even though obviously, a lot of big players have come into the market in Europe as well, and there's a lot of, consolidation has been happening, and maybe that's something we can talk more about, but there still feels like that sort of enthusiasm and freshness that we saw in the US before. And I think that brands are starting to wake up to the potential of podcast advertising in the, the Europe and the rest of the world. That's reflected by the brands that are attending the conference, as I mentioned, but also some of the data that we've been looking at internally, Steve, in terms of advertising spending. It's still very small in almost every country outside the US, and actually pretty hard to get any data on. This year is the first time I've seen any sort of centralized data about global podcast advertising spend across countries. And James, I'd be interested to know actually if you're aware of any secret sources of that data. But all of these markets are projected to have 5-10% compound annual growth rates in advertising revenue for the next 5 years. So really exciting space to be in, and mirroring really what's been happening in the US.
Amelia, are you seeing this trend in the same way that we are? I mean, are you seeing more requests from the companies that you talk to, specifically with Intel, wanting to know more Intel and understanding around how they're operating outside of the US and as a consequence of growth in international?
Yes, absolutely. And I think both on the publisher and the brand side, more brands are, looking to, like, again, expand that reach and, reach other people outside of the US. And then I think publishers are also starting to really take notice. I think the podcast space in countries outside of the US is very focused on content, and ads are sort of an afterthought. And I think that's starting to change a little bit, which has its good and its bads. So these publishers are now, thinking about, all right, if we want some of the US advertisers that really take this stuff seriously, how can we bring them in, and what tools and technologies do we need to have in place in order to make that happen, and all of that sort of stuff. So absolutely. I mean, we just launched some international research tool as a direct, sort of request again and again from both advertisers and publishers.
Cool. And so with that in mind, actually, and I'm going to sort of pose this to James and Miranda so that I can distribute the answers. What do you think are the main differences that we're seeing between the US market and international? Obviously, some things spring to mind. Guess what? Not everybody speaks English, and we have to go into other markets and figure out not only translation areas, but I like to call it transcreation, because it's not necessarily just about converting it into a local tongue, but also in terms of nuance and idiosyncrasies about each market. Is there anything else? I mean, obviously we've got GDPR concerns in Europe with regards to how deep we can get in terms of focusing measurement, but are there other areas you think that there are key differences between the two very split markets?
Yeah, so happy to go first, James. So Stephen, to your point, I guess, aside from the very specific and important nuances with each market, I think overall I'm seeing kind of 5 key differences between Europe and the US. The first thing is just in terms of operations. I think many of these markets aren't dealing with the pressures of demand, right? So there hasn't been a boom like we saw in the US. And so they're operationalizing a lot more slowly and methodically, and they're able to take those learnings from the US, which makes it a lot more smooth. And then the second thing, and Amelia, you kind of brought this up, was just ad loads, right? So you had mentioned that publishers and creators are really focusing on content and now beginning to look at the business aspect of it. There was some data presented at the conference showing that ad loads are growing everywhere. But one thing, to note is that internationally, they are still much lower in non-English speaking markets, like in France and Germany. So when we're having conversations with these publishers, I was pleasantly surprised to, hear that like max ad load is like 3 ads per episode max. Most are typically like 1 to 2 compared to the 5 to 15 in the US, depending on the publisher. So we do see that CPMs in Europe are higher, but there's a lot less clutter. Advertisers are able to stand out. And so we do see that it can perform better. And that kind of tells into the next key difference, which is from my experience, the European publishers generally care a bit more about the listener experience and kind of preserving that, right? So it goes back to the lower ad load. There's a lot more collaboration in working with advertisers to make sure that their ad content matches the show. And in many cases where journalists are hosting, whether it be in a news or any other genre, if they're journalists, hosts are not allowed to read the ads. The next sort of big trend is just in co-sales. So because the supply in most of these markets is much greater than the advertiser demand, content is becoming less exclusive, right? So these creators, these publishers are offering their inventory in lots of different places to a lot of different resellers. And so from our perspective, from an agency advertiser, operationally makes it sometimes easier, but I will say we prefer to always work as closely to the creator as possible. So when you add more people into the equation, CPMs go up. And then the last thing that I would say that I'm kind of noticing is because the markets are smaller, the sort of cultural and economic factors have a much stronger impact on how business is done. And so I would just say it's really important, much more important to be familiar with each market.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with a lot of that. And I think, I did a piece of research with Will Page, the former chief economist of Spotify last year, and we worked out that in terms of if you adjust it by country, the UK is earning 22% of the revenue of the US in terms of podcasting. So the UK is, not doing fantastically in terms of revenue. Australia, by the way, doing 38%. So Australia doing, rather better. So I think that that's interesting. But I think also part of that is because, of course, many people in the UK grow up listening to audio with no commercial messaging in it at all. The BBC has a 50% market share in terms of radio. It has a good market share in terms of podcasting as well. In the UK, at least right now, there are no advertising messages in those at all, not even sponsorship credits. And that makes a big difference for advertisers understanding how to advertise in those particular shows, because they can't. But also it makes a big difference in terms of listeners, dealing with advertising because they're not used to hearing as much advertising as there is in the US. So there's a big sort of cultural difference there as well. The other thing I would say, particularly when you start looking at different countries and different languages, is that there's a whole sort of different industry again. So France, for example, has very much split in terms of what they call radio podcasts and native podcasts. An awful lot of reheated radio in their charts, which the BBC doesn't really do that much of anymore, which is nice. And so, it's just a little bit different. And, I think it's a dangerous thing to point to the podcast show in London as being reflective of the entire European industry, because each European industry is very different in terms of the German, the French, the Spanish, and so on and so forth.
Which is why it's so fascinating. I'm actually going to stick with you a second, James. I'm going to jump one of the questions and come back to it. So it's very pertinent what you're talking about. And firstly, congratulations on your keynote last week. It was short and sweet, but really, as always, very pointed and clear. And a lot of people came away with a lot of useful insight that they can apply on their business. There's one thing that stuck out for me that you talked about, which was where you expressed your concern specifically over BBC Sounds and the fact that you believe, or at least the indications in the market would believe, that they're potentially more of a threat to open podcasting than Spotify are at the moment. And I know that for any of you out there who wish to listen to the speech, you can find it on the podcast app, but I'd love it I know it's a small nuance, but I'd love to get your perspective slightly more detailed on that, James.
Yeah, and it's a very parochial thing, this, only really for people in the UK. But at the moment, if you're listening to a BBC podcast, you can hear them everywhere, wherever you get your podcasts, in most cases, although not in all cases. But but the BBC has its own app called the BBC Sounds app, very different to the iHeart app, for example, or the Odyssey app, in that the only shows in there are BBC shows. with 2 or 3 that they've bought in. So the only shows in there are BBC shows. I'm not in it, you're not in it, your clients aren't in it. And so that really means that it's not a proper podcast player. And what they're now doing is they're floating the idea of, as I've put it in my keynote, penalising the UK public by putting ads in shows if you don't listen in BBC Sounds. So it penalises the UK public because all of a sudden you've got all of this clutter and advertising in there, but also it's taking millions of pounds away from independent podcasting as well. So it's just a UK thing. It's probably good news for brands who want to be next to BBC content. But what I would say is, do that carefully and make sure that you're not just buying the BBC. Make sure that you're buying as many other outlets as you can in the UK, because that would be the right way of doing it. And to me, it's a bit weird seeing the BBC fighting against open standards and open podcast apps when the BBC was the first big broadcaster in Europe to embrace podcasting back in November 2004. It's really sad to see them trying to bully their audience into a closed podcast app that doesn't have any of our stuff in it.
Which would be very unusual for the corporation to ever try to do, right?
Well, we did bump into one of their senior salespeople, didn't we, Miranda, on the floor? And I thought just the perspective that they hadn't perhaps well rehearsed, at this point, because I know they faced a lot of objections in the UK, James. But, it was interesting to hear him put it this way, which was, it's absolutely a unique situation for, other commercial platforms to be leveraging and potentially monetizing and benefiting from a public broadcaster's content, which essentially is what is happening when BBC content is consumed on other apps, and that's unprecedented. They said anywhere else in the world, and as always,
that's nonsense, isn't it? That's utter nonsense. NPR's stuff goes on to Spotify, goes on to everywhere else. CBC's stuff does. The ABC stuff in Australia. It's utter nonsense, and the BBC should know better than to start claiming that they're super special in the way that they end up doing things. They've got this well-rehearsed but nonsensical argument, and it's no surprise that 20 different podcast organizations signed an open letter saying, please don't do this. It's chicken feed money in terms of how much you'll earn from it anyway, but it will really damage the rest of the independent podcast media in that country. Miranda is nodding her head in agreement, which is always a nice thing to end up seeing.
Well, not least of which, because Giles did say something quite important that made my ears prick up, was that you actually bumped into a salesperson from the BBC, because we're struggling to find one to actually do some business with. But I'm kidding, of course. But no, that would be good. Okay, well, that leads me on to my next question. I'm going to pose this to you, actually, Giles. Were there any emerging trends or technologies that you saw coming out of the show? And I know you and I are in a lot of meetings. I didn't get to see all the panels that we maybe wanted to, but specifically, I'm going to slightly lead the witness on the question. But anything you gleaned with regards to how programmatic is being embraced in Europe outside of the US, and were the conversations the same?
I mean, there's a lot in that question. I think that there's obviously a lot of tech on display at the show. To the extent that it is sort of unique to Europe or international markets, well, I mean, tech sort of tends to transcend all these national boundaries for the most part. I mean, one of the guys who seem to be getting quite a lot of attention generally who are at the show, getting a lot of attention recently, is Wondercraft, for their sort of AI-based creative script development and voiceover ads, and the extraordinary amount of control you can apply to those voiceover ads. I thought that's interesting tech. I actually preferred even more their AI recap of the top 10 daily stories on Hacker News. I think that's a really interesting way that content can be sort of summarized and repurposed and repackaged up in a way that makes it easier for people to consume. I've been wanting to stay up to speed with Hacker News for at least 10 years, and I very rarely read it. And the fact that it's been summarized in an AI podcast that's 5 or 10 minutes long is just phenomenal. So I think that that's a really interesting trend for the future. Again, I think it applies to all countries, but they're headquartered in London, those guys. I mean, I think one particularly with regard to international, we were chatting with, I think it was Zeno, and they have got in their platform a tool that will insert an ad, but automatically run it in the language that's local to the listener. And I need to dig more into that because, as you said earlier, Stephen, like it's, you know, you speak Italian fluently, like languages are, you can't just sort of translate and expect it to work perfectly. There is nuance to it. There is also, like you said, cultural, you know, nuance and localization that matters. So I'd like to dig into that more to hear how that exactly works and how they get over those obstacles. But certainly a very interesting trend with regard to, you know, international particularly. And, you know, I think, again, as with the other example, you know, points towards an increasingly sort of sophisticated and fast moving future.
Well, not to jump too much on the AI bandwagon, but I'm going to, just because, you know, it seems to be being talked about quite a lot at the moment for some unknown reason. But I think the general trend or conversation pieces that I gleaned from the show was that most people, at least most people that I came into contact with, were of the same idea that clearly it's going to be augmentative rather than taking over, and that nobody really wants to see the day where hosts are just going to be popping out shows that are completely, you know, machine learned and artificially created, which I think is right, because otherwise that completely bursts the bubble of the authenticity of why podcasts are so popular anyway. But I'm interested, James, obviously you're a Brit, but you've been in Australia for a number of years, which by all accounts, for a market of only, and you're going to correct me here, of I think it's 13 or 14 million. Is it right in terms of population?
Yeah, it's a little bit more, but yeah.
A little bit more. It's incredibly advanced.
Doing very well.
Yeah, how is it being adopted there within what is obviously clearly a very mature international podcast market?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's some interesting things going on in Australia. There have been a few interesting AI things. For example, news.com.au, which is one of Rupert Murdoch's many outlets in Australia. They are advertising using AI voices, which are essentially taking the latest headlines. So as you're streaming a new show, you hear what the latest headlines are on that news site, which is a very clever way of using, you know, programmatic, automated podcast creative. So I think that that's a nice plan. But there are also a bunch of interesting, you know, folk trying some interesting ideas. Michelle Laurie, who is a ex-radio person, does a very popular true crime show. She's also doing a news show, which is all AI cloned voice. And, you know, and I've listened to it, and it's an interesting listen. I'm not sure I would listen every single day, but there's certainly something going on there. I think one of the things that, you know, I mean, I reported on earlier on this week is actually what's going on in the market in terms of players. So the Listener app, which is an app run by Southern Cross Austereo, one of the big broadcasters here, they've just announced some interesting work with databases. So they've got their own first-party database of nearly 2 million people, but they're allowing advertisers to merge their databases with that information so that they can target more effectively. And they're using a third party to end up doing that. And I think that there's some interesting work going on there in terms of, you know, how you can actually target people better and do a better job of targeting that. There's lots of privacy controls in there as well, but it seems like a sensible idea.
Absolutely. So moving on just slightly from that, kind of just want to get the group's perspective. What do you think are the main challenges facing podcasters, networks, and indeed brands in Europe? And I mean, we can all speak to that. We at Oxford Road have a number of the partner companies that we're working with that are all significantly starting to deploy dollars outside of the US. And so my question is more sort of, how do we think these challenges compared to the US, and what can the business do about it? Is there anything that springs to mind for you, Miranda and Amelia?
I think one of the biggest challenges initially is just sometimes the sticker shock. As I mentioned, because there are less ads in order to like turn a profit, you know, a lot of these publishers need to charge a CPM. And that's not to say it's not worth it. Like I said, it can take a little bit more time, but we do see that it can work out. So I think that can be a challenge. If I look back, you know, a year ago from now, I think just having enough research and resources to really find local publishers and get in contact with and build relationships with publishers in each of those markets was a challenge for us. It wasn't easy, but I feel like we're in a really good place right now.
Yeah, I would kind of second that. I think, you know, if the EU and the podcast space outside of the US has really been focused on content, obviously figuring out like on the host read side and stuff, how to start to integrate that and what best practices are is going to be a little bit of a challenge. But I also think it's an interesting like opportunity because unlike the US, if they're so focused on the content, I think there's a huge opportunity for them to really like merge, you know, the ad creative and, you know, the strategies and stuff that, you know, Stu talks about on his podcast all the time with the actual, you know, ad and stuff. So I think it'll be interesting. I think there's definitely some training and some best practices that need to happen. But I think it's sort of an interesting dichotomy because if they're so focused on the content, we can still make ads, you know, similar to content and make it feel like content. I also think that, you know, one of the challenges as they're starting to, again, try to reach, you know, these US advertisers and understanding the expectations that they have, you know, measurement comes up and obviously we're Podscribe, but, you know, I think understanding even that there are solutions out there, why, you know, you pay for them, why the advertisers expect them, what they bring. There's a lot of education that needs to be done. I mean, even in the US, we're still working on that. But I think I talked to so many different publishers and even like programmatic partners, and they were like, what? Like we can put a pixel in this? Like I didn't know that. So I think that's, again, another opportunity, but definitely a challenge to sort of better understand, again, what the expectations of these other advertisers are and how you can effectively, you know, again, introduce ads as content and, you know, really see that performance and measure it.
That's really interesting. One thing that resonated with me when I was there that I'd like to, I'm not sure if everybody saw the panel. I'm going to have to name check the person on the panel when we publish this because I don't remember. It was early on in the week and so much happened. But one of the panelists they were talking specifically about measurement, and this statement came out that stuck with me, which was, you know, at the end of the day, this is an incredibly exciting space to be in. Podcast is exploding, but let's not also forget that in terms of total advertising, it's gonna, if it does get to 4 billion this year, it's still going to be sub 1% of all advertising. Nonetheless, an incredibly important and powerful channel, as we can all attest to. But one of the panelists on one of the early sessions said, you know, she made this statement. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with it, but I'd love to get your perspectives, which was, is podcast being held to a higher level of scrutiny for such a small amount of money versus all of the other platforms that suck up vast majorities of other advertisers' dollars and don't necessarily get scrutinized in the same way? Now, I know that a lot of folks who've come through to have ownership of audio dollars, of course, are invariably exceptionally skilled digital natives and come through digital channels and expecting those kind of levels. But do we think that's a fair statement, that podcasts may be being over scrutinized and that sometimes there should be more of a degree of bravery? I'm just, you know, I don't know whether I attest to it or not, but I think it's an interesting perspective.
I think so a little bit, but I think it happens with any sort of new and emerging channel. I mean, we could probably look like even Pinterest, right? Like they're a big platform. They've been around for a really long time. They've got an ad solution and measurement capabilities, and even they get looked at much differently than Facebook. And Facebook and Google are really the standard, and that's hard to, you know, to sort of like come up against that. So I think it just takes a little bit of, you know, like you said, bravery, but also just understanding like the nature of the medium and how powerful it can be. I think there's a lot of patience involved in it too. I mean, a lot of brands, again, you can, you know, put the Facebook pixel on your site, you can get an ads manager account, and within 5 minutes, you could literally have ads going live. And that's obviously very, very different. And you can't do it that way in the podcast space, which again is an opportunity, right? Not everybody's flocking to it. And so, you know, it's going to grow a little bit slower and the opportunity is still there. So I think so. I just think we need to continue to educate, share stats, benchmarks around, you know, what looks good, what looks bad. I mean, but marketers are looking looking for new channels to expand into. They need to diversify their media mix. Facebook and all these platforms, their one-to-one attribution is not the same. It's going to get even worse. And I think, compared to billboards or other out of home or CTV, I think we're probably in the middle in terms of ease. It does take a little bit of time. You probably should work with an agency at the beginning, build those relationships up. But I would say that launching a podcast ad is probably easier than getting a billboard out in Las Vegas. So I do think there's a lot of opportunity there, and we just need to educate and bring a little patience there.
Well, I was just going to add, I think I was at that panel as well, Stephen, and I think that woman was talking from the creator perspective primarily. And I think, a couple of things sort of come to mind. I think partly she was sort of alluding to, download standards and how do we count downloads? And, do we still need to be talking about this and the level of detail and time that we give to it? Like, are we not close enough already? And I think that there's definitely some legitimacy to that. As if we're working towards some type of perfect standard. When you think about Nielsen, the currency in TV since, the old king died, and, they lost their media accreditation from the Media Ratings Council, was it last year or the year before? So, even in tried and trusted channels like TV, the standards and the measurement is not as perfect as you would think. And I think that there's very much some legitimacy to that point. I think perhaps she was also making some kind of reference to, her download numbers being significantly impacted by Apple's iOS 17 changes, which obviously can be a big factor too. But can I just mention one of my favorite marketing stories of all time, when you mentioned that about sort of getting started on Facebook and how their metrics are so tried and trusted. I think it came from Markowitz, and it's at least 10 years old. But the story was Facebook was offering some type of audience in Australia. This is what made me think of it when we're talking about the Australian population. I think it was like men 25 to 44 in Australia. And someone had put a screenshot of the Facebook platform and the size of that audience, and then it made the observation that that audience was actually larger than the entire population of Australia. So, these channels, like Facebook and Google, they're the gorillas. They've sort of got the trust because, they are who they are. But actually, I think that they get away with a lot less scrutiny than perhaps a lot of other channels, and perhaps they deserve.
Well, this was the point that I was trying to emphasize, and I think it's often overlooked. Did you have any thoughts on that, James, at all, or would you tend to sort of agree with what the group's saying?
Yeah, I think, a good amount of agreement there. I think one of the nice things going on in the conference was a lot of people talking about consumption data being much more important, actually, than download numbers. Download numbers are fine, but as you say, we can make those download numbers even better if we want to. But the reality is, as we know, is that some shows are downloaded and never listened to. So actually the consumption information there is the most important thing. And we can get some consumption from Apple Podcasts manually because there's no API into it. We can get some consumption detail from Spotify, again, manually for most people, because Spotify, although it does have an API, doesn't open it up to very many people. And I think it would be great if both of those large companies who have some really robust consumption data were able to actually share that a little bit more.
So James' point, I think in terms of measurement, I would advocate that we aren't close enough. From my perspective, like the data is there, it's possible to get closer to the truth in terms of listenership. And as someone who's like on the front lines negotiating and planning, there are a lot of different options. Like it is an important metric. But, there's, I think, even a hesitancy from publishers and creators to share certain data points. And from my perspective, that's really frustrating. And so what I would say is, for those who are willing to be transparent, honest, and upfront, those are the type of partners that we're willing to be, where we are, willing to prioritize in terms of media dollars.
Excellent. So we're almost at the end. I've just got a couple more questions that I want to pose, and I'm just going to go around it. I'd love to hear from each of you, but especially for we've all been to the shows in the US, and this is more for our colleagues who organise those. What do we think the US shows could learn from our experience at the International Podcast Show, and maybe even vice versa as well? Apart from obviously being able to make a much better cup or brew of tea while we're here, and obviously than the UK podcast show. Is there anything you think that we could import, from international to make the US shows even better? apart from the beautiful venue, which really, you're right, James, it's stunning. It's just so well, it's all self-compact and everything.
Well, I think that's actually a key point, is it's how compact it is a really refreshing thing, I found. And I don't know if you guys had the same experience here, but you know, you can cover everything really easily and really quickly. It's really easy to bump into people. It's relatively easy to find people. It's relatively easy to get to where you're going. And as James said, it's in the same place every year. I'm now familiar with the layout. I don't think I've quite got the pubs and clubs of Islington down as well as he has, but I do know the area a bit. And I think those are all things that we can, you know, we can perhaps do better in the US. You know, some of the there's so much space in the US generally relative to Europe that, you know, many of these venues are absolutely massive. And you know, I think Miranda was saying sometimes you're spending just 5 or 10 minutes walking from one room to another room, or 15 minutes trying to find the right room. And I felt like it was that compactness perhaps just made the whole show a bit more efficient in London. So that might be something that the US might consider.
I have a couple things. Did you guys notice that all the panels, they had like those silent disco headphones? I thought that was absolutely brilliant. I mean, obviously, or at least at Evolutions, it was all the panels were in rooms, so it was a little bit different. But then in Denver, right, like one of the biggest things was that you're, you know, whoever talks the loudest, you're listening to their panel instead of yours. So I thought that was really cool. Yeah. Obviously, probably expensive and a little difficult, but super, super smart. I think the other thing was the location too. I mean, obviously, again, it's much smaller, or you know, like the area is, you know, different than, you know, parts of the US and stuff. But like, you know, in Denver, right, we're by the airport. There was no like going out. You had to stay in the hotel. And I think people really liked, you know, like the number of like podcast people I saw just at the cafes and at the bars and stuff right in the area, having those meetings and being able to do that rather than being sort of confined. I thought was beautiful. And then I think the last thing I was going to say, again, I agree with the, you know, the size of it. It was just so easy. And the content in particular of the panels, and I didn't get to watch that many as I wanted to, but I feel like, you know, sometimes we're getting the same stuff every year at Podcast Movement. And I get it. And that's not bad, but it's, you know, it's all how to gain buyers' trust and how to do this. And sometimes it just feels a little bit unauthentic. And I think this one, like the diversity of it, the types of, you know, conversations that were being had were really, really interesting. And I would love to see more of that, a little bit more risk taking, a little bit more diversity, and to just change it up a little bit, you know, in the US version.
Yeah, and I would jump in and say, I mean, so firstly, I'm in a weird situation in that my business partner is Podcast Movement, which I should probably declare, but I'm also on the advisory board for the podcast show, which I should probably declare as well. But I think, I mean, I am currently speaking to you now from a resort hotel in Orlando, and these sorts of hotels drive me mad because you are stuck in the hotel. I've discovered that there's a Walmart which is relatively close to me, but unfortunately it's the other side of a busy highway, so therefore it's impossible to walk to it. So yeah, you know, that sort of thing makes a big difference. And I remember Podcast Movement in Philadelphia, which was a really lovely experience because you were right in the middle of downtown, and that was super helpful. So I think that's certainly one thing. But I think we should also not overlook that it's exciting for many people from the US to come to London. London is an amazing place. And actually, from a point of view of just the reason why it felt so different and so exciting is that there were many more people with my silly accent. You couldn't pay money in the bars with your American US dollars. You didn't have to give people tips either, because you know in the UK people are paid correctly. So all of that kind of stuff meant that it just felt a little bit different. And I think that's one of the reasons why the podcast show feels so different and so refreshing and so exciting, is the fact that, yeah, it will be because you're in a brand new country, because it's just a very exciting time to actually go out and do a proper trip out.
Absolutely. I would encourage a lot of the international attendees to perhaps even come and experience some of the shows in the US, which would also bring an international flavor to it. I mean, you're right as well, Amelia. You know, these things, and I mean this affectionately to all of the conferences we attend in any category, in any vertical. There's a tendency for them to become echo chambers, right? The same kind of things tend to get talked about. Sometimes that happens, but I found the audience that was attending the podcast show in London incredibly engaged, incredibly collaborative. A lot of the conversations that we're taking outside of the panels were really interesting, and getting those nuances and perspectives of the local markets, meeting the Italians, meeting the Spanish, meeting the Germans, and seeing how enthusiastic they were in terms of how their individual markets were growing, regardless of some of the local challenges they faced, was just really, really refreshing. So with that, you don't all you probably all covered it off, but I'm just going to go around. If there was one thing that remained with you most at each of the shows that you want to impart to our listeners, what would that be? And I'll go to Miranda first.
Yeah, so what I would say is internationally, these markets are still sort of building the groundwork, and I think there's a real opportunity to be a part of shaping the future. It's becoming increasingly evident how important it is that agencies and advertisers, as they expand into these markets, advocate and really stand for diversification among the different partners and creators, and just start to rely much less on, the giants within our industry.
Absolutely. James, anything?
Yeah, I think the big thing is collaboration, and that feeling. I've been to a lot of radio conferences where there isn't much collaboration, but there is still an awful lot of collaboration in every podcast conference that I go to, and I think that that's definitely one thing to bear in mind. If you did get a thrill from finding your passport and leaving the US and visiting somewhere else, I would also possibly recommend Podcast Day Asia, which is happening in Kuala Lumpur on September the 3rd. And the only reason that I mention it is that I am programming that. If any of you want to come and be a speaker, then excellent. But that I think would give you another very, very different view into the industry as well.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting. I'd love to learn more about that, actually, James. May not be some of the folks on this call, but we have a lot of folks that we work with in Asia who represent Oxford Road. So if it isn't us, yes, we'd love to take part of that. Giles, any thoughts?
I just think it's a really exciting time to be involved in podcasts internationally, and if you're a brand thinking of getting in, it's definitely feels like a good time. Like the tailwinds are there. The enthusiasm in the market is there. The publishers are willing and open and realizing that there's a big growth opportunity. And also, because of the size of these markets, we were talking about this the other day, Stephen, we're talking about strategy for some of our clients. You can make such a big splash in these markets as an advertiser for relatively modest investment, and really have a significant share of voice among an audience that is highly desirable for many, many brands. And I think there's lots of exciting opportunities there for brands if they're ready.
Without a shadow of a doubt, especially in Southern Europe where they're just hungry for it. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Amelia, we'll finish with you. Is there anything you wish to add?
Yeah, no, I guess I would just say, like, it was so exciting. You can feel the energy. To what everybody said, we're in just such a unique, fast growing and exciting industry. I feel like podcasting is kind of like the Wild West. It's the last frontier of digital marketing, layer marketing, at least as where we are right now. So I just walked away from it, like, again, feeling rejuvenated and just really excited to be a part of this, and the collaboration that we're all working together, competitors or not, whatever it is, to push the industry forward. And you can just feel that there.
I couldn't agree more with everything that everybody's said. I just want to add one other point to it, which is in the US, it's taken the better part of 12 to 13 years. And that's really only when we saw the real advent of podcasts coming out around about 2010 and 2011. I think the international market is going to benefit from all of the learnings that everybody on this call has had in terms of a US experience. And I think it's going to be way quicker. I think they're going to get to the same levels of maturity in a much shorter space of time. And it's going to be exciting to see what happens over the next 18 months. And hopefully all of us get together at the podcast show next year around about the same dates in May. So listen, it's been It's been a real pleasure hosting this show. Lovely to see you all, and so glad you all joined. It's been a really interesting debate. So with that, I just want to thank you all. I've got a couple of words to say at the end of this, which is, thank you to the guests for joining. This podcast is brought to you by Oxford Road, where we want you to succeed in all forms of audio advertising and influence for good. As members of a marketing community, we have a power to advance the voices and the things that we say. And we don't just want to entertain, but we actually want to create and edify conversations that are going to make, across all of the different spectrum of areas that we discuss in our industry. Building bridges and preserving a fair-minded discussion is most important for us around the topics that define our category in the age that we're working in. So, if you're a marketer listening to this show and you're looking to align your brand values with extraordinary business outcomes, feel free to reach us here at Oxford Road, and you can find us at oxfordroad.com and subscribe to our weekly newsletter, The Influencer, and of course all of the various different newsletters that our illustrious guests, James and Amelia, put out there in the industry, which are equally as important and equally as valid for you to be listening to. So with that, I just want to make one shout out, which you also did, Amelia, to Stu, who hosts our other sister podcast called Ad Infinitum, which really dives deep and focuses on messaging within the industry, which I think is equally as important for all of us. At the end of the day, we can put the best media plan together. If the creative isn't working, it really doesn't matter. So that's incredibly important with what we're doing. So with that, thank you for listening, and I look out to have lots of more lively debates with all of my fellow guests here on the podcast. And thank you very much, and wishing you all a wonderful weekend, because we're recording this on a Friday. So safe travels, James, and lovely to see you, Amelia, Giles, and Miranda. Thank you very much.
Okay, pop quiz. Have you ever heard of these companies? Shopify, Bayer, Oracle, Indeed, Masterclass, Babbel, Tommy John. We could go on. I don't just host the Media Roundtable podcast, but I have the good fortune of being the CEO of a company called Oxford Road, where we are the world's leading independently owned and operated agency specializing in audio. Think podcasts, radio, and streaming. And what that means is that we get to help great companies worth fighting for, grow with audio advertising, whether it's podcasts, radio, or streaming, and all its various tentacles. This includes media planning and buying. We do analytics, attribution, and insights. We also have a special way that we deal with creative and copy generation. It's our own proprietary process called Audiolytics that allows us to score ads for their persuasiveness. Bottom line is, we don't just work here. Audio is our passion, and we want to lead this industry to new heights beyond what we've ever seen so far. That's why we've been leading the industry in brand safety and suitability, and actually bringing you solutions to market so that you can evaluate the way that you get placed in a show so that it matches up with your values, in addition to avoiding the things that might be problematic for your brand. If you're a chief audio officer and you're looking to get best in market performance at maximum viable scale, do get in touch with us at oxfordroad.com. Or if you love audio and are strategic, relentless, and looking for a career change, consider joining our mission as a fellow agent of influence. Just flip us your resume through oxfordroad.com. And if you're working anywhere in the audio industry and you're serious about this business, make sure you go to oxfordroad.com. Easy to spell. Sign up for our free newsletter, The Influencer, at oxfordroad.com, and make sure you mention that you heard about us on the Media Roundtable podcast.
Hi, this is Daniel Rue from the Real Jam Radio podcast. BetOnline is your number one source for the NBA Finals and Stanley Cup Finals this season. Every stat, matchup, and even live odds and spreads in real time during the game. And once the game's over, you can head to the online casino to get in on a game of blackjack poker, over 150 slot games. BetOnline has also all the latest stats, news, and scores available for all your favorite teams, including Major League Baseball, golf, MMA, and boxing. So get the latest odds and lines, latest team matchups, player props, and odds on just about every sport out there. So head to the website today and get in on the action at BetOnline. The game starts here.
Earning your degree online doesn't mean you have to go about it alone. At Capella University, we're here to support you when you're ready. From enrollment counselors who get to know you and your goals, to academic coaches who can help you form a plan to stay on track. We care about your success and are dedicated to helping you pursue your goals. Going back to school is a big step, but having support at every step of your academic journey can make a big difference. Imagine your future differently at capella.edu.